His rifle was older than the war. His boots had holes in them. He'd never been to school past the 6th grade. When he showed up to basic training, the drill sergeant took one look at him and laughed. Military records from the era document this moment repeatedly. Rural Appalachian recruits arriving at training camps and being openly mocked by officers who measured a soldier's worth by his education and his address. They were measuring the wrong things, because deep in the jungles of the Pacific, where some of the most disciplined fighters on earth were waiting, this young man from rural Kentucky became one of the most documented precision shooters America deployed in the entire Pacific theater. The military's own after-action reports logged over 80 confirmed combat engagements, one man, one rifle, and a lifetime of skills nobody bothered to measure. Where it began, Breathitt County, Kentucky, early 1920s, one of the most isolated communities in America. No electricity, no running water, roads that turned to mud rivers every spring. The nearest town was 2 hours by mule. Historical records from the Appalachian region during this period document what sociologists later called a subsistence hunting culture, meaning if you wanted to eat, you learned to shoot accurately, and you learned fast. By age 7, boys in communities like Breathitt County were regularly taking squirrels and rabbits at distances that would impress trained military marksmen today. Not because someone enrolled them in a course, because if they missed, the family went hungry that night. Fathers handed sons a single bullet in the morning. One round, one animal. Come back empty-handed. And you explained yourself. No second chances, no wasted ammunition. The cold mathematics of rural survival in Depression-era Appalachia. By 12, the boys who survived that upbringing had developed something no military training program had figured out how to manufacture. They learned to read wind by watching tree movement at different heights simultaneously. They learned how morning light bends differently than afternoon light at distance. They learned that their own heartbeat, if uncontrolled, could throw a shot 6 inches off target at 300 yards. And they learned to shoot between heartbeats at 12 years old. Without knowing it, they were training for a war that hadn't started yet. December 7th, 1941. He was barely 20 years old, splitting firewood on a gray morning when news reached the hollow. Pearl Harbor, America at war. He set down the axe, walked inside. His mother, like thousands of Appalachian mothers documented in letters from this period, didn't cry. She said what mountain families said to their sons in those weeks: do what needs doing. 3 days later, recruitment offices across Kentucky were flooded with young men from the hollows and ridgelines, boys who'd grown up hunting, boys who'd grown up hungry, boys who'd spent their entire lives learning skills the military didn't know how to test for. Fort Campbell, 942, standard qualification course targets at 200, 300, and 500 yards. Military training records from this period document a pattern that repeated itself dozens of times across American training bases. Rural recruits arriving with no formal firearms education, no military background, and then stepping onto qualification ranges and producing scores that left experienced range officers reaching for their radios. The Army's own training analysis from 1942 and 1943 noted repeatedly that recruits from rural Appalachian and rural Southern backgrounds consistently outperformed urban recruits on marksmanship qualification by statistically significant margins. The military had spent years and millions of dollars trying to train what these young men had simply grown up doing. When range officers encountered these scores, the response was always the same: find out where this kid is from. Get him to the Scout Snipers program. That pipeline, from rural recruit to specialized precision shooter, is documented in Army records throughout the war. It happened over and over. The mountains were producing marksmen the military couldn't replicate in training. By 1943, young men from this pipeline were deploying to the Pacific, the most brutal theater of the entire war. Historians and veterans alike have documented the unique ferocity of Pacific Island combat. The Imperial Japanese soldier was trained under a code that made surrender culturally unthinkable. They fought from fortified caves, from tunnel networks dug 30 and 40 feet underground, from elevated jungle positions that gave them clean sight lines on American advance routes. The terrain itself was a weapon. Jungle so dense visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Heat that decomposed boots within weeks. Malaria, dengue fever, and jungle rot that killed as efficiently as enemy fire. And throughout the trees and ridgelines, Japanese sniper teams executing a documented tactical doctrine. Target officers first, eliminate leadership, stall the advance. American after-action reports from Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and Leyte all document the devastating effectiveness of this approach in the early months of the Pacific Campaign. Something needed to change. American military command recognized the problem and the solution simultaneously. Counter-sniper operations required a specific type of soldier. Not the fastest, not the strongest. The most patient, the most invisible, the most capable of thinking like a hunter rather than a soldier. Documented military assessments from this period describe the ideal counter-sniper profile in language that reads almost exactly like a description of rural Appalachian subsistence hunters. Comfort with extended stillness, ability to read natural environment for movement cues, understanding of animal behavior as an early warning system, experience operating alone without supervision in hostile terrain. The young men from the Kentucky Hollows and Tennessee Ridgelines didn't need to be taught these skills. They arrived with them. Military records document counter-sniper teams in the Pacific operating with extended periods of complete motionlessness, 6, 8, 10 hours, in positions that urban soldiers found psychologically impossible to maintain. For a boy who'd grown up lying still in a deer blind before dawn, it was just another morning. The number didn't happen overnight. It accumulated across months of island combat, one documented engagement at a time. Guadalcanal Peleliu, Leyte. Historians studying Pacific Theater sniper records have documented several American scout snipers accumulating engagement counts in this range during the island-hopping campaign of 1943 and 1944. The tactics these men used are still analyzed. Position selection based on bird movement. Animals avoid areas where predators are positioned, and experienced hunters know to watch where birds don't land. Shot timing based on observable enemy behavioral patterns. Every soldier develops habits, and patient observation reveals them. Wind calculation using natural indicators. Grass movement, smoke drift, leaf behavior at multiple distances simultaneously. These weren't military innovations. They were hunting techniques, translated into the most brutal application imaginable. Late October 1944, American military records from the Leyte campaign document numerous instances of fortified Japanese positions halting American advances for multiple days. Machine gun nests with concrete reinforcement, overlapping fields of fire, every approach covered. The documented counter to these positions, when frontal assault had failed and artillery couldn't get a clean angle, was precision sniper elimination of the crew. Military records describe engagements at ranges between 600 and 900 yards. They describe calculation of wind speed and direction. They describe observation periods lasting hours before a single shot was taken. They describe the absolute silence that followed a successful engagement. And they describe, in the dry language of official after-action reports, American units advancing past positions that had held them for days. Because one man with one rifle had been patient enough to wait for the right moment. Here is what military historians have documented as one of the quiet failures of American personnel evaluation in World War II. Academic testing nearly eliminated dozens of the military's most effective specialized operators before they ever reached the field. Men who couldn't pass standard literacy or mathematics evaluations. Men whose test scores placed them in low-priority assignments. Men who came from addresses that made recruiting officers laugh. The Army's own post-war analysis acknowledged that standard qualification testing had almost no predictive value for performance in specialized roles like scouting, counter-sniper work, and reconnaissance. The skills that mattered in those roles, patience, environmental awareness, physical endurance, calm under extended stress, weren't measured by any test the military administered. They were measured by whether you came home with food or went to bed hungry. The mountains measured them every day. The military almost missed it entirely. The war ended the way wars end, out with celebration for everyone, quietly for many. Documented accounts from Appalachian veterans of the Pacific Theater describe homecomings that were deeply private. Men who got off buses in small towns and walked home through familiar woods. Men who sat on familiar porches and didn't speak about what they'd seen. Men whose families understood, in the tradition of mountain culture, that some things didn't need to be said. Letters collected by the Kentucky Historical Society from this period describe veterans returning to subsistence routines, chopping wood, hunting for food, sitting with aging parents on porches overlooking ridgelines they'd looked at their whole lives. The medals went into boxes, not from shame, from a cultural understanding that the men worth honoring were still buried on Pacific Islands. That's documented too, in letters, in diaries, in oral history recordings made decades later by historians who drove into the hollows and asked the old men to talk. Here's what the historical record actually shows. America nearly failed to deploy some of its most effective specialized military assets because the evaluation system couldn't measure the right things. Recruits from rural Appalachian communities, measurably poorer, measurably less educated by standard metrics, consistently outperformed their peers in the specific skills that determine survival and success in Pacific theater combat. Post-war military studies acknowledged this directly. The training programs tried to catch up. They developed new assessments for patience, environmental reading, and stress management under extended isolation. They were trying to manufacture what certain communities had been producing naturally for generations. Hunger produces capability that comfort can't replicate. Survival produces skill that no classroom delivers. The Appalachian Mountains, ignored by the rest of America, mocked by recruiting sergeants in 1942, sent men to the Pacific who performed at a level the military is still studying. They came from nowhere the world cared about. They did things the world still can't fully explain. And most of them came home and never mentioned it again, because that's what you do when you're from the mountains. You do what needs doing. Then you go back to your life. One shot, don't waste it.